And thank you all, of course, for being here with us this afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about nature and socialism. I don't think I need to spend too much time detailing how capitalism has degraded the environment and put into the question the very future of humanity. I could really spend all of my 20 minutes just listing environmental statistics, but here are just a couple that I pulled recently, mostly from the Environmental Protection Agency. 1 in 4 mammals are at risk of extinction. Half the world's tropical and temperate rainforests are now gone. 75% of marine fisheries are now overfished or fished to capacity. 6.8 million people die every year due to air pollution. And most shockingly, 1 billion people in the world today are estimated to not have access to clean and safe water. And this last statistic really brings into focus the fact that the degradation of capitalist environments are not spread equally across the globe, both at a local and global scale. Here in Philadelphia, access to green space is limited for both minorities and those with lower incomes. Globally, the situation is even more dire, where the global south is often the dumping ground of the global north. But even there, exposure to environmental hazards is influenced by class, race, and gendered factors. People are starting to take notice and take action on environmental issues, but unfortunately, this is largely through free market environmentalism, green capitalism, or whatever else you want to call it, ranging from green consumerism, sustainability, and the commodification of nature. Green consumerism refers to further individualized environmentalism, removing the need for any form of collective action. Furthermore, green consumerism removes the need to think about decreasing consumption. Instead, we just need to consume the right things. It's basically just business as usual, as much about feeling good as yourself as about saving the world. To use the example of compact fluorescent light bulbs, one of the most popular green consumers technologies, I read recently that if everyone replaced all their incandescent bulbs with CFLs, it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the United States by less than 1%. This is not to say that people shouldn't consume more environmentally friendly products. I do so myself when I can afford it, but to think of it as a solution to our environmental problems today is extremely short-sighted. Sustainability is focused upon a techno-managerial solution that ignores socio-environmental inequality and injustice, refusing to define what is sustainable and for whom, refusing to consider major social political change, still remaining predicated upon a market logic, opening up new avenues for capital accumulation. Finally, the commodification of nature through mechanisms such as carbon exchanges, payments for ecosystem services, and emissions taxes refuse to understand that ecosystem services are a social practice of value articulation, never an objective process. Commodification of nature silences other ways of knowing and valuing nature, avoiding any form of locality, process, social anchoring, and history, assuming that nature is substitutable and exchangeable at a global scale. Following Sean Sullivan, markets do not care if rainforests fall, if glaciers shrink, or if the values of indigenous cultures are displaced or captured in the service of capitalism. And it seems to be mad to think that it is only their correct construction, for instance, through pricing mechanisms, that will prevent the manifestation of these losses. So what did Marx have to say about nature? These are definitely kind of the two most quoted pieces of Marx on nature. The first from the economic and philosophic manuscripts. Marx said, nature is man's inorganic body. Man lives from nature. Nature is his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. To say that man's physical and mental life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to himself. And from Chapter 8 of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx said, by thus acting on the external world and changing it, he at the same time changes his own nature. Despite this fertile ground prepared by Marx, it was not really until the 1970s and the 1980s that Marxists really began to take environmental issues seriously. I'm going to introduce probably the three most famous eco-Marxists, James O'Connor in the late 80s came up with his theory of the second contradiction of capitalism way before David Hardy had 17. Rather than a crisis of overproduction like the first contradiction of capitalism, O'Connor argued for a second contradiction based upon the underproduction of nature. In the 1990s, John Bellamy Foster put forth his theory of the metabolic rift, based upon the idea of a metabolic relationship of circulation between humanity and nature that was threatened due to large-scale capitalism, seeing this as producing a rupture in the relationship between the two and leading to an ecological crisis tendency within capitalism. Finally, the late Marxist geographer Neil Smith theorized the production of nature. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. The production of nature removes the barrier between society and nature, getting beyond the powerful fetishism of a pristine nature in itself to focus on the social relationship of nature. Nature is generally seen as precisely that which cannot be produced, the antithesis of human productive activity. But Smith saw nature is produced through labor, reducing Hegel's distinction between a first pristine Edenic nature and a social nature to recognize that the two are no longer distinct entities. Rather, labor produces one out of the other in both directions. Recognizing that nature is socially produced changes the political question, ending the doom and gloom of Malthusians and others who proclaim the end of nature, the death of nature, the domination of nature, and so on. Instead, the question becomes how, by what social means, and through what social institutions is the production of nature to be organized? How are we to create democratic means for producing nature? And finally, what kind of nature do we want? These are, in the end, the central questions for a revolutionary environmentalism. I think despite going further than other ecological Marxists, there's still some critiques that can be made of Smith's production of nature. It's still too anthropocentric, although he acknowledges that the production of nature is not the same of control of nature. There's still a lack of a full consideration of nature's agency, as to how we saw this very afternoon with the downpour. And as Felix Guattari puts it in the Three Ecologies, nature kicks back. There's also a great need to look at the different natures produced by different types of labor, including non-human labor, and this could help to reduce some of the issues with anthropocentrism. So through the lens of the production of nature, we are allowed to develop a political theory of nature that can express the very real project of domination embodied in the capitalist mode of production, thinking of it as a domination of both people and nature. This argument necessitates the joining of anti-capitalist and environmental movements. While the end of capitalism doesn't necessarily result in a harmonious social relationship with nature, it is certainly a prerequisite for that to happen. We need to recognize the inevitability and creativity of the social relationship with nature, which means to me we need a creative environmental politics. We need to be willing to fail and willing to recognize our failure and try new things. We also need to be willing to recognize the differentiated relationship with nature according to class, race, gender, and other factors. As discussed earlier, environmental hazards and amenities are experienced differently by different people based upon structural inequities. And I see a real need to work with different oppressed groups to help to erase these inequities and not neglect them as the traditional environmental movement has done in the past. Finally, we need a strong response to the almost instinctive romanticism in bourgeois and patriarchal society. The worship of wilderness and pristine nature is detrimental to environmentalist and socialist causes. And I'm not saying that wilderness is not important, but just simply that fetishizing it causes us to ignore the very nature on our doorsteps in urban areas. So what does this kind of environmental politics look like on the ground? This is definitely something that I'm still thinking about, but I have one example of how we can work to combine ecological and anti-capitalist struggles. This is Philly socialist Cesar Ander Iglesias Community Garden just east of here. And of course, an urban garden may seem like a trendy mainstream environmentalist project that will most likely result in gentrification. But for us, it was as much about urban land reform and reappropriating the commons as it was about growing vegetables. We were working to improve the environmental, social, and economic conditions in neighborhoods that have largely been abandoned by the state, hoping to agitate and organize oppressed and exploited residents. I think it's important to recognize as well that we're not the only group doing this in Philadelphia. This has kind of become one of the common tactics. Groups like Hip Hop for the People and Philly Urban Creators are kind of combining ecological and anti-capitalist struggles, working to both improve material urban environments and resist gentrification. Now, of course, there's scalar issues. We can't have socialism in one vacant lot, never mind one country. Once again, I'm going to turn to Neil Smith and his idea of jumping scale, how we can move from the lot to the neighborhood, to the city, to the region, and eventually to our socialist world. And we really need to think how we can support regional, national, and global struggles. I'm going to kind of conclude, maybe give you some takeaways. Hopefully it's been clear throughout my presentation that I've been arguing that socialism and environmentalism must work together for either of them to be truly successful. We should always be looking for opportunities to jump scale, striving to include the exploited and oppressed, who often bear the harsh consequences of environmental degradation. And finally, our eco-socialist organism and organizing and activism should be creative, inventive, maybe even playful, and willing to fail and move on. Thank you. Next we have Ariel and Melissa on socialism and gender.